Alberta and Ontario are joining forces to push for new railways and pipelines. Today, Premiers Danielle Smith and Doug Ford signed two memoranda of understanding in Calgary. One of those documents focuses on new pathways for resources, saying they'll work together on the development of rail infrastructure to support the subsequent phases of the Ring of Fire, where Ontario hopes to mine critical minerals, and on joint development of commercial options for building new oil and gas pipelines. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mark Carney gave another boost to a potential pipeline today, telling the Calgary Herald that it's highly likely an oil pipeline will make Ottawa's major projects list. Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta, and she joins me now. Premier, I was going to say welcome to the show, but it feels like I should say howdy, perhaps?
Howdy. As I told you, David, this is formal wear at this time of year in Calgary, so I hope it's not distracting for your audience.
No, it's perfectly fine. Look, I want to get into the deal you signed with Ontario today, or the memorandum of understanding with Ontario, but I want to get your reaction to what the Prime Minister said over the weekend when he was stopped by a reporter or a columnist with the Calgary Herald, and he said it's highly likely a pipeline will make Ottawa's list of projects for fast-tracking. How do you respond to that statement? How do you interpret that statement?
I'm very encouraged by that. I mean, one of the issues that we have found in talking with the pipeline companies is that almost every one of them agrees that the best project for us, the highest value, easiest to build, that opens up the new markets in Asia would be a pipeline, a bitumen pipeline to the Northwest BC coast. And so we've been advocating that from the very beginning. We know that there's an opportunity as well with the Pathways project to be looking at how we might have a more decarbonized product going through. And so those two projects together, I think the Prime Minister seems to have some interest in. They have to do a little bit more work, because putting something on a project list is, of course, a necessary condition to getting it done, but it's not sufficient. If we want anything to be built, to be drilled to go into that pipeline, we need to change the overall investment climate. So we have a lot more work to do on that front.
Right. So to get on the list, though, it needs a proponent. And the Prime Minister is also quoted in this Calgary Herald piece as saying the private sector is going to drive it. You're talking to the companies, I get that, but is there a proponent? Is there someone getting ready now to come with a proposal to the federal government, to the new major projects office, say, this is our plan, this is who we are, this is our money, let's go?
Well, I can tell you that we hear from the pipeline companies that as long as there is a greenwashing bill that makes it criminal behavior to talk about their emissions reductions, as long as there's a tanker ban, and as long as there's a production cap, which is they say it's an emissions cap, but we know it's a cap on production, that there's not a lot of enthusiasm for a private sector company to come forward and waste a lot of money going through the process if it's not going to result in more production. So that's why I said we need to address those bad laws in order to create an environment where there's a lot more investor confidence. And if those two things can happen together, I also share the Prime Minister's enthusiasm that it will be a private sector company that builds it.
I know you've talked about the 9 laws that you don't like that the federal government brought in. I don't know if the Prime Minister is going to go as far as you would like him to, but he has said there's ways to deal with the tanker ban. He has given some assurances of some sort of action to allow it to happen. So based on that, I mean, they're hoping to get a list of projects, I think, by this fall, at least the initial tranche of things. Do you think there is a window here for a pipeline to make that initial list, or is it going to take longer than that based on the environmental and regulations as they exist today?
That's the time frame we're working towards. We would like to see a bitumen pipeline on the projects list for the fall, and in good faith, work with the federal government to see if we can get a 2 years to yes on the permitting side. And at the same time, we're going to be forwarding our ideas about how they would either substantially revise or repeal the 9 laws that we know from our business community are creating a chill in the investment climate. Because remember, the pipeline companies, they're not the ones producing the emissions. It's the oil sands companies, the SAGD companies, the conventional oil companies. They're the ones who are creating the emissions. And if there isn't a reprieve on that emissions cap, then they're not going to be encouraged to drill. So nobody wants an empty pipeline. If we're going to do this and create new markets, we have to create an environment so that all the players in the energy industry are able to have confidence to go forward.
Okay, the memorandum you signed today with Ontario on energy and on critical minerals, how does Ontario support help Alberta get a pipeline built? This is not to the Northwest BC coast. This is something going west to east.
Well, I had a round table with Premier Doug Ford with probably about 30 energy industry executives from pipelines to midstream to upstream and more. And one of them said that they had gone through their supplier list and they buy $1.5 billion worth of material from companies based in Ontario. We know that Ontario has a huge steel industry. We should be buying more pipe and more products from Ontario rather than sourcing it from the United States. Those are the kind of conversations that we've been having. In return, we buy a lot of cars in Alberta, and there's 10 brands that are finished in Alberta, and so or in Canada, and we've agreed that our fleet vehicles, we're going to make a priority to buy those 10 Ontario-based cars so that we can support that industry as well. But interestingly, the Premier is very interested in, I don't think I've seen an Ontario Premier talk about oil and gas pipeline infrastructure as much as this one. He wants to see if we can build a pipeline to James Bay, and coupled with icebreakers to be able to get our products out into the east coast of Canada and also onto Europe. And it's not just, if we can do those kinds of projects along with new road infrastructure, rail infrastructure that helps critical minerals, food, fiber, manufactured goods. I think that that's the kind of thing you're seeing all of the premiers look at, is how do we get a double win? And I think that Premier Ford has been a real leader on that.
Well, look, there's obviously the emissions concerns of increased oil production that a lot of people will have, and there are specific challenges with bitumen going through ice waters and into the Arctic that is risky and makes it difficult. But again, this memo, it talks about a pipeline to Ontario, including James Bay, that you mentioned. But again, there's the absence of a proponent, right? So, I mean, where is it on that front with this specific project? Because the economics of the Northwest BC coast that you talked about seems a little bit more clear than the west to east going to James Bay, because there's multiple provinces, multiple jurisdiction, and a port in an ice water zone that needs to be resolved. So how does this one see the light of day?
We have 10 years of a federal government destroying investor confidence, costing tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to flee elsewhere. Is it going to turn around on the basis of a few words and a few words of encouragement from the Prime Minister? Probably not. But I think when you start seeing that every single premier is looking for ways that we can move from the historic answer of automatic no to automatic yes, I think that that's encouraging. The world changed in November. When Donald Trump got elected in the United States. And I think the Canadian sentiment has changed. When we do polling, we find that well over 70% in most jurisdictions support the idea of us supporting each other and building energy infrastructure. And so that's what we're going to work towards. The future world, if you look at the OECD projections, is that we're going to grow from 104 million barrels per day to 120 million barrels per day as the 5 billion poor people on the planet aspire to have the same quality of life that we do. And if there's going to be a slightly larger pie, I think Alberta and Canada should also be making sure that our product is getting to market. There aren't a lot of great jurisdictions and reliable jurisdictions on the planet that provide heavy oil. Venezuela, Iran are two examples. We want to be able to provide our allies and our trading partners with a reliable supply of this energy. And I hope that the rest of Canada cheers us on in that. I know that Premier Doug Ford is, and I'm grateful for his support.
Well, look, the Prime Minister and his Energy Minister, Minister Hodgson, they've suggested a willingness to support pipelines and other projects for decarbonized oil. And I know environmentalists and others quibble with that phrase because they think there's no such thing as a decarbonized barrel of oil, but they meet on the production end and the transmission end. You've said it here that you want the emissions cap lifted, you want other things lifted. If things like the Pathways Alliance carbon capture can get fast-tracked, can go ahead and can capture carbon and reduce emissions, why do you need to lift the emissions cap if there is these other avenues and other ways, like small modular reactors for energy sources, for example, at mining sites, that can allow you to boost production, get a pipeline going, and reduce emissions at the same time? Why do you need to lift the cap if the path is there?
Well, you have to work at the speed of technological change. You can't put an arbitrary rule in place that you have to be decarbonized substantially by 2030 and expect that within 5 years that's going to happen. Small modular reactors are a great option, but most people don't think those are going to roll out until about 2035. If you want to try to get an at-scale CANDU reactor, that's probably about the same time frame. So that's the real problem that we're having. I've always said we can reach carbon neutrality by 2050, but you have to work at the scale of innovation. You have to be able to adopt the technology as it becomes available. And the proposal of the Pathways Group is, yes, carbon capture utilization transportation and storage, as well as being able to use hydroelectric or nuclear and have interties from our neighbors to decarbonize at the front end. And then also direct air capture. Carbon engineering has just come back to Alberta so that they can experiment in that sort of last mile of how do you capture CO2 from the atmosphere and turn it into useful products. So that's the reality of what it is that the Pathways group is proposing, but that takes time. And so if we can stretch out and align with other trading partners around the world, remember China's not intending to reach their target till 2060. India is not intending to reach their target until 2070. Let's allow for a little bit of latitude for the technology to work, so then we can export that technology to the rest of the world too.
Okay, one last question. The memo you signed with Ontario, it includes a joint feasibility study to help move private investment. So if a pipeline project needs significant financial help to make a business case, is Alberta willing to subsidize it, and how far are you willing to go on that?
Well, I can tell you we have pipeline companies that literally spent billions and billions of dollars on a failed regulatory process. So we have already said that we want to do what we can to de-risk it. We can pledge barrels to be on those lines so that when they go out and ask the market to participate in it, we're demonstrating that we want to be first in. But make no mistake, we need to have it on the list. We need to see that the 2 years to yes is a real proposal. And then once we get to that process, I'm quite sure that the private sector is going to be encouraged to be able to build it. If we go through this exercise and the federal government has to build another pipeline, then I think we failed at the process. What it is we're trying to do is get investment confidence back so that the private sector can invest in all of these projects. And, and that's what we're prepared to work with the federal government on.
I don't see a world where the federal government builds another pipeline. Do you? Do you say that as hyperbole, or do you think that's actually a possibility in this process?
Well, that's what had to happen because the regulatory process caused Energy East to fail. They pulled the plug on Northern Gateway. The last one standing was the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and they built it at 5 times the cost of the private sector proposal, and only because the proponent was going to pull out of that one too. That's what I mean. It was a demonstration of how damaged the investor confidence was. So if we can turn it around and have a proponent come forward, build it, I think that's going to demonstrate a lot of confidence that we've managed to fix the underlying problems. And I think that would be good for all of the country, not just for our projects, for mining projects, for transmission projects, and for all of these other nation building projects that every premier wants to keep on advancing. Right.
Yeah. Well, with TMX, there were issues with BC and Alberta, and and provincial rights and federal rights as well. But I take your point that it took the federal government to get it there. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, always appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Talk to you again.
Alberta and Ontario have a new pact to try to get oil and critical minerals moving across the country. Today, the provinces signed a memorandum to study new railways and pipelines and to pressure Ottawa to kill or change a number of regulations, including the Impact Assessment Act.
We need to get rid of all the red tape and regulations. We could be the most prosperous, strongest, richest, wealthiest country in the entire world. I'll never forget when I met with our First Nations partners when I was in Toronto. And one of the chiefs said, we could be like Saudi Arabia. I almost jumped over the table and hugged the guy.
Stephen Lecce is Ontario's Minister of Energy and Mines, and he joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show. It's good to see you, sir.
Thanks, David. Good to be back.
Premier Smith told me just a bit ago that she doesn't think she's ever seen an Ontario premier talk as much about oil as Doug Ford. Why is Ontario backing Alberta's push for pipelines so strongly?
I think, we're backing Canada's path to self-reliance, and part of that means we've got to get Canadian resources to Tidewater. There's a competitive disadvantage for all Canadian taxpayers when there's a 20 to 30% cost differential. We all want revenues to invest in social programs that we care about, health, education, infrastructure. We can't do it without a revenue source. And our government, certainly under Premier Ford, has never raised a tax, which begs the question, how do you grow an economy? How do you create jobs? How do you lift people up without imposing a burden on people? And that's by growth, economic growth. And so a pipeline is one of the initiatives we've championed, in addition to a transmission corridor, a new port. This is an East-West energy alliance that we can emerge as an energy superpower. And that can't be a talking point for governments any longer. The path to delivery is unlocking our resources. Critical minerals, yes. Nuclear power, and yes, oil and gas.
But you know, the economics, pipeline economics at any rate, you know, the oil sands companies and Premier Smith herself would tell you that the highest value is to get to the West Coast, to get into British Columbia, to get to the Pacific markets, and there's environmental concerns and other concerns there. What you're talking about here is something going the other way, to James Bay and Hudson Bay. Would a proponent look for that if it's not as economical or as profitable as going to BC?
Yeah, it'll be project driven or proponent driven for sure. But these are different markets that they can serve. Looking at the northern BC route will certainly be consequential to the Asia Pacific, which has been putting up their hand for interest in liquefied natural gas or petroleum. And likewise, Europe on the east side of the country, where that export market is desperate for LNG that is not owned by Vladimir Putin. The German chancellor was in Ottawa just months ago, effectively begging us, saying, you know, we have a customer in Europe for Canadian commodities, ethically sourced. We share their values, the highest environmental and labor standards, Indigenous equity in the projects. I mean, we do it right in Canada. Certainly when compared to the Venezuelans or the Russians or the Chinese that dominate the critical mineral or the resource space. So this is about the geopolitical change of Canada. This is about building one strong national economy. And fundamentally, this is about ending the importation of American natural gas and petroleum. We can do it here in Canada. We don't need to be dependent on them. In Ontario, David, as you will know, there is a pipeline called Line 5 that moves petroleum and aviation fuels, among other commodities, through America to Ontario. The governor of Michigan started a campaign to shut down the pipeline.
Right.
The president at any moment could shut down that pipeline, which would literally deny 100% of the aviation fuels for our planes at Pearson. It would literally increase costs overnight for millions of consumers that fill up their gasoline every day. So this is a real national security risk.
Right.
So when we have a plan, let's put it into action. And today is about launching this corridor study to figure out how do we do this and how fast can we move for the benefit of Canadians?
Well, let's talk about that feasibility study for energy corridors. You said you'd also look at financing for projects. I mean, is that public financing we're talking about here? How much money is Ontario willing to put up to create a business case for some of these projects?
You know, look, this is what this whole undertaking is going to allow us to do. Figure out the route, think about the costing and the regime that's the sort of the regulatory regime that's going to help drive this forward. The feasibility study will lay out those recommendations. We're starting this officially today by launching it. But you raise fair questions. I mean, how do we create an efficient environment where capital flows in the province? I met with the energy leadership of Canada yesterday with Premier Ford and Premier Smith and my parliamentary colleagues. And many of them spoke about upwards of $20 to $40 billion of capital that they've sat on or moved into the U.S. market because we just don't have the right legislative framework. It's just such a difficult place to get to yes. I mean, projects sit under the National Impact Assessment Program for years and years. And so our message to the federal government is, look, our collaboration will be fundamental. The early indications are that we can work together in the national interest. And we're really hoping the feds will move on some of the meaningful reforms or the abolition of some of these legislative policies that have held back our potential by leveraging the feds, working with us to get to yes, and frankly, getting out of the way a bit because we have policies that by their design are killing the investment of capital and job creation in Canada.
Right.
So we think there is a way to do this. We just got to do it together. And that means working across party lines.
Well, the calibration will be key because some of the projects that died in the past were because they were pushed through too quickly and proper consultations weren't done and proper considerations weren't done and the court said you can't do this and then other issues. But what I want to ask about next is the memo talks about pipelines and energy corridors to James Bay, where Premier Ford says he wants a deep sea port. But we've seen that part of the country has been looked at for a national marine protected area, and they've done feasibility studies there on water depth, and it's essentially concluded that it's too shallow. You cannot do a deep sea port up there to ship critical minerals and things out through James Bay into Hudson Bay. I mean, how do you pursue this? Why pursue this if the water just isn't deep enough for it to work?
Yeah, I mean, part of the study is to understand, is there a geography that enables this type of export into the European and to foreign markets? And we do think through James Bay there is. We have icebreakers that are available and more coming online through the Coast Guard that can be used to make this a 24/7 all-season export port for Canada. Remember, we have a lot of skin in the game. We have significant ore and natural resources in the Ring of Fire. The agreement signed today is not just for petroleum or oil. It's actually for nuclear power. It's for small modular reactors, which we in Ontario are leading the way on, working with Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick to build out their SMRs. We're building the first in the G7. This agreement also enables transmission expansion. So my point simply is we're looking at the feasibility of, is there a space in that bay that allows us to move ore and our critical minerals to foreign markets with speed and greater efficiency for those investors? We think there is a path, but obviously part of the feasibility is the acceptance that science and a professional study is what's going to guide our policy. At the end of the day, we're looking for a solution. One of the challenges that you mentioned that impeded our ability to get to yes also was Quebec. Right. In the energy project. And that's not speaking disparaging. It just factually, they effectively vetoed that project. We're in a different world with the phrasing of the question in Quebec. Do you want to displace, Donald Trump's natural gas, for example, with Quebec-sourced and natural gas? 6 in 10 Quebecers put their hand up saying yes. So I think the world has changed, public opinion has changed, social acceptability has changed, and geopolitics and economics have changed, thus enabling us to actually pursue a path to the port, to the pipeline, and yes, the transmission corridor.
Yeah, look, there's no question it's a different context, but the water depth hasn't changed, right? Like, I have to go back to this question. Like, in trying to get ships to Moose Factory, which is, one of the communities there near James Bay, I mean, it's a relatively shallow 4-meter draft on a ship. Like, that is not a big ship. It couldn't get there. It had to anchor 20 kilometers offshore. If you have those sort of water limitations, I mean, how do you build a year-round port when this is like this? You're not even dealing with ice. You're just dealing with water depth.
Yeah. I mean, the feasibility study that we're launching and the consultations that have already began is about figuring out, is there an infrastructure play to build out given the geographic realities of that region up in the James Bay and that peninsula. We recognize and we believe that there is a path forward. We also recognize we have rail connections. We have some of the enabling infrastructure that's in place. And therefore, we think this can be a natural export terminal for much of the resources in Ontario and Western resources that are landlocked, where we continue to sell at a discount to America. So hear your question. We understand it fully. The feasibility study will dictate the viability of the project, but there certainly are proponents we're hearing that are interested in exploring this path. And that's why we think a serious plan for a new deep sea port will unlock the long-standing barrier of keeping our resources landlocked and not getting them to tidewater.
Okay, well, one last question, Minister. Premier Ford said today that a First Nations chief told him Canada can be like Saudi Arabia, and the Premier said he almost jumped across the table to hug him. I mean, how can Canada be like the Saudis? Should Canada be like the Saudis? Because some people will hear that and go, wait a minute, Premier Ford, what are you talking about here?
I think certainly that Premier Ford is talking about us in the context of our energy superpower capacity. We already have the top 10 reserves of natural gas and petroleum on Earth. We have the first SMR, small modular reactor in the G7 being built here. We have literally the largest continental nuclear build on the continent taking place here in Ontario. My point to you is we can be an energy superpower, we can have abundance, but we got to get it out of the ground. And that's been our longstanding challenge, getting it to new markets, diversified markets well beyond America. So I think what his ambition is to make sure that we scale up and step it up when it comes to resource extraction, exploration, processing, and value-added jobs. And that's where perhaps that example, I think, is compelling because they are a top producer and they move with speed. And so we want to do so. Our advantage, of course, is the strongest environmental and labor standards on Earth. We want to maintain that to build confidence that our global customers know that they have a reliable, democratic nation that's ready to provide the resources, the critical minerals, and the natural gas that the world needs.
Okay, Premier. Minister Lecce, we have to move at speed because we're out of time. That's Ontario Energy Minister Stephen Lecce. Thank you, sir.